long before the thunder of artillery echoed across Europe in 1914, before the trenches of France were carved into the flesh of the earth, and decades before Hitler's voice roared through stadiums, whipping a broken people into blind frenzy, something darker was already unfolding. History often hands us clean headlines: a gunshot in Sarajevo, a dictator in Berlin. But those are just the sparks. The fire was already smoldering beneath the surface. The truth is not etched in textbooks or summarized in classrooms. It hides in the cold mechanics of power, in the boardrooms of empires, in the silent corridors where kings whisper and bankers scheme. And it begins not with war, but with fear. Fear of being replaced, of losing control. In the twilight years of the 19th century, Britain stood as the crowned ruler of global trade, its empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. But something was rising in the east, a young, aggressive, industrial Germany, its factories blazing with productivity, its steel output soon eclipsing Britain's, its ambitions too big to be ignored. By 1900, German goods flooded the market, and British elites quietly but deeply felt their grip slipping. They saw it not as competition, but as a threat to their very survival. So they built ships, dreadnoughts, monstrous floating fortresses of war, and Germany answered, ship for ship, in steel and blood and pride. This wasn't just an arms race, it was a signal, a whisper that grew louder with every cannon forged: we will not go quietly. But while Europe flexed its muscles, the real game was being played far beyond its borders. In Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the great colonial powers devoured land, lives, and legacy. Britain and France had carved up the world, their flags planted in stolen soil, their wealth siphoned from conquered nations. And Germany, new to empire, wanted in. It demanded its place in the sun. But there was no room left without war. In 1905, Germany challenged France's hold on Morocco. It was a diplomatic grenade that nearly exploded into global war. In 1911, they tried again, sending a gunboat, the Panther, to Agadir. It was meant as a show of strength. It nearly triggered catastrophe. These weren't isolated incidents. They were rehearsals. The world was walking toward the edge long before the first bullet struck the Archduke in Sarajevo. That bullet wasn't the cause. It was the excuse. Europe had become a powder keg of promises. Britain, France, and Russia, bound by the Triple Entente, were staring across the table at Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Alliance. On paper, these pacts were designed for peace. In reality, they created a death spiral. Any conflict, however small, would ignite all the dominoes. And the war plans were already in motion before the leaders even knew it. Germany's Schlieffen Plan demanded an immediate invasion of France via Belgium if war ever loomed. Russia's mobilization plans guaranteed that even a whisper of German aggression would unleash total war. Britain had blockades ready to choke supply lines before the first soldier even marched. The machinery of destruction had been oiled for years. It only needed a trigger. When the war finally erupted, it swallowed the world, and when it ended in 1918, it left behind a shattered generation. But the war was not over. It had only mutated. The Treaty of Versailles did not bring peace. It delivered humiliation. Germany, blamed entirely, was handed a bill it could never pay and a national shame it could never cleanse. By 1923, inflation had transformed the German mark into toilet paper. People burned currency to stay warm. Starved children lined the streets. The soul of a nation had been gutted, and in that vacuum monsters found their voice. This is where Hitler was born, not biologically, but politically. He was the product of pain, of humiliation turned into hate. The 1930s were a masterclass in silence, the world watching as fascism tightened its grip. In Germany, Hitler's words turned into laws, and laws into death. In Italy, Mussolini fed the people dreams of empire and soaked the soil with blood. In Japan, a hunger for resources drove them to brutal conquest. But what connected all these regimes was not ideology, it was collapse. The Great Depression had cracked open the system. In Germany, the Nazi Party was fringe, until it wasn't. Starvation, fear, desperation. They don't just break societies, they make them malleable. They make them obedient. Hitler didn't take power, he was handed it by people desperate for order, for hope, for revenge. And so, while the world clung to the illusion of peace, it was sleepwalking into something worse than war. It was walking into annihilation. But again, the truth hides deeper still. Even Hitler, even Mussolini, even Hirohito, they were not lone architects. They were vessels. Behind them were banks, corporations, old money, the kind that survives any regime, any ideology, the kind that funds both sides of a war and profits when the dust settles. As Germany rearmed, Western companies looked the other way, or worse, helped. IBM machines cataloged victims. American oil flowed into Axis tanks. Swiss banks swelled with stolen gold. Evil is rarely chaotic. It is efficient, and it often wears a suit. So when tanks rolled into Poland in 1939, it wasn't just the start of World War II, it was the climax of a long, quiet orchestration, decades of wounds ignored, of warnings dismissed, of greed cloaked as diplomacy. History says Hitler started the war, but what if he was just the final note in a symphony that had been playing for decades? A song composed in boardrooms, in backroom deals, in treaties written with poison ink. What if the world never really emerged from the shadow of World War I, but simply fell deeper into it? Because history is not made by the moments we remember. It is made in the silence between them, in the choices unseen, in the forces we refuse to name. We like to imagine we would have stopped it, that we would have seen it coming. But the scariest truth is this: most people didn't. They were too busy surviving, too distracted by fear, too trusting of those who promised strength. And so the cycle began again. Not with a war, but with a whisper. It begins not in Berlin, not in London, not even on the blood-soaked fields of France, but in a quiet room where ink met parchment and men in tailored suits charted the fate of nations over brandy and ambition. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. On paper, it ended the war. In reality, it carved open a fresh wound across Europe, one that would rot from within. Germany, stripped of dignity, was forced to wear the mask of guilt, her colonies stolen, her army neutered, her economy shackled to an impossible debt. Reparations so vast they defied logic. The victorious powers didn't just punish Germany, they poisoned her future. And no one understood this better than the men who watched from the sidelines, waiting not for peace but for opportunity. The Weimar Republic was born into chaos, fragile as glass, governing a nation where food cost fortunes, and the dreams of empire still haunted the old guard. Children played with worthless money. Veterans limped through alleys, forgotten, and beneath this something darker began to stir, a quiet storm of resentment, humiliation, and rage. In the beer halls of Munich, that storm found a voice. It didn't shout at first. It whispered, promised, lied beautifully. Adolf Hitler was not yet a dictator, just a failed artist with a talent for fury. But he knew the wound, he felt it, and he knew how to infect it further. The Nazi Party didn't rise overnight. It crawled, it festered. It waited for the right sickness. That sickness came in 1929, when Wall Street collapsed and the world unraveled. The Great Depression wasn't just a financial disaster. It was psychological. It shattered faith in democracy, in fairness, in the very idea of stability. And Germany, already broken, was hit hardest. Desperation makes radicals, and in that desperation, the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe group into a mass movement, not through force, but through votes. Hitler didn't take Germany. It was handed to him in 1933, legally, democratically, by people who had nothing left to lose. But Germany wasn't the only nation listening to the drums of dictatorship. In Italy, Mussolini had already marched on Rome. In Japan, the military seized control from civilian government, launching a brutal conquest of Manchuria in 1931. The world was shifting. Old empires were dying, and new monsters were taking their place. Yet the West, still drunk on the illusion of peace, refused to see the pattern. Appeasement became policy. Denial became doctrine. When Hitler rearmed the Rhineland, Britain and France watched. When he annexed Austria, they blinked. When he took the Sudetenland, they cheered the peace for our time. Each violation, each broken treaty was met with diplomacy instead of defiance. And why? Because the world was still haunted by the ghosts of the last war, the trenches, the gas, the dead. They wanted to believe Hitler was different, that he just wanted justice for Germany, that maybe, just maybe, this time would be the last time. But Hitler never wanted peace. He wanted vengeance. He wanted blood. While Europe played games of policy, Hitler played chess. In secret, he built tanks, trained pilots, perfected blitzkrieg, the lightning war that would rip through nations before they had time to react. His scientists pushed boundaries of warfare and medicine that bordered on the grotesque. The Nazis weren't just militarizing, they were mythologizing, twisting history, reviving ancient pagan symbols, inventing racial hierarchies. It wasn't just about land, it was about identity, superiority, purity. And as Jews, Roma, Slavs, and countless others were blamed for Germany's past, the world watched and debated. While trains began to run on time toward the camps not yet built. The silence was deafening. But this wasn't just a German problem. In Britain and America, fascism had admirers. Prominent voices praised Hitler's efficiency, his strength, even his economic policies. Racism wasn't exclusive to Berlin, it was global. Eugenics programs existed in the United States before Hitler ever put pen to paper. Anti-Semitism simmered everywhere, and so when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, it wasn't just a betrayal of peace. It was the brutal confirmation that the world had failed to learn. Britain and France declared war, but they were unprepared. Poland was crushed in weeks, not months. The Nazi war machine was faster, more brutal, more efficient than anyone imagined. And behind it came the SS, cleansing cities, burning archives, executing scholars and priests. Hitler didn't just want victory, he wanted erasure. As World War II erupted, history split like a cracked mirror. In France, the Maginot Line, an outdated defense strategy, was bypassed in days. Paris fell without a proper fight. The once proud French Republic collapsed into collaboration. In Britain, the Blitz turned cities into ash, but the people held. Churchill's voice roared against the dark. But across the Atlantic, America hesitated. Isolationist, cautious, wounded from the last war. It wasn't until 1941, when Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor, that the United States entered the fight. The war was now truly global. But even then, the real horror was still hidden. In the East, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union opened a front soaked in unimaginable cruelty. Civilians starved, frozen, butchered. In Leningrad, people ate wallpaper paste and each other to survive. But worse than the battlefield was the plan unfolding behind it. The Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with lists, with ghettos, with neighbors disappearing, with silence. Then came the camps, factories of death where science, industry, and ideology merged into mechanized genocide. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. These were not accidents of war, they were the goal, the final solution. Cold, calculated, systematic. 6 million Jews, millions of others. Roma, disabled, political prisoners, queer people, all vanished into smoke, ash, and mass graves. And still, many did not believe it. The scale was too vast, the evil too organized, the victims too voiceless. Back in the West, the Allies began to push forward. Africa, Italy, then Normandy. D-Day was not the beginning of victory. It was the desperate gamble of a world already consumed by flames. As soldiers waded through blood on Omaha Beach, they did not know what they would find beyond the hedgerows, only that if they failed, darkness would win. Cities burned, empires collapsed. And in 1945, the war ended not with a cheer, but with a scream. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 flashes of light, 2 shadows burned into stone. The atomic age was born not out of triumph, but terror. When Hitler shot himself in a bunker, when the camps were liberated, when the war crimes were revealed, the world promised never again. But that promise too was a lie, because even in the ashes, the same forces survived. Fear, greed, nationalism, the same ideologies whispered in new languages. The Cold War began before the bodies were buried. Stalin replaced Hitler in Western nightmares. America and the USSR divided the globe like thieves splitting treasure. Scientists from Nazi Germany were recruited, secrets were buried, justice was selective, and those who had suffered most were often left out of the rebuilding altogether. The truth is, World War II did not end, it evolved. And so we must ask ourselves, not what started the war, but what made it possible. Was it a single man? A single ideology? Or was it the silence of millions who looked away, who chose comfort over courage, who thought evil only wears a uniform when, in fact, it often wears a smile? These are not distant questions, they echo still. Because history, as we know it, is not a straight line. It is a circle, and the most dangerous thing we can do is forget. The war was over. At least, that's what the newspapers claimed. Hitler was dead, the camps were liberated, cities lay in ruins, and treaties had been signed. Soldiers returned home to ticker-tape parades or empty homes. But beneath the rubble and celebrations, something else was taking shape. Something colder, more strategic, more sinister. Victory had not brought peace. It had simply redrawn the battlefield. The blood was no longer being spilled in trenches or jungles. It was now being traded in secrets, spies, and ideologies. The Cold War had begun, not with gunfire, but with paranoia. Not with tanks, but with silence. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was split in two. On one side stood the United States, now the undisputed titan of the West. On the other, the Soviet Union, risen from the ashes of a devastated Eastern Front, determined to claim its seat as a global power. But this wasn't just a rivalry over land or politics. It was a war of ideas, capitalism versus control, hope versus fear, or so the story went. In reality, both sides operated in shadows. They funded coups, they armed rebels, they toppled governments and installed puppets. The moral high ground vanished. Ideology became a weapon to justify whatever was necessary. In Germany, the division came fast and surgical, West and East. Democracy and communism, split by a wall of concrete and machine guns. Families separated, lives dismantled. Berlin became a symbol of the world's fracture, a city that never slept, where spies watched from rooftops and betrayal could be purchased with cigarettes. But even more disturbing was what lay beneath this division. The same scientists who designed gas chambers and built rockets for the Reich were quietly folded into new roles. Operation Paperclip, a secret American program, brought Nazi scientists to the U.S. with new names, clean records, and government jobs. Werner von Braun, once a member of the SS, became the father of NASA's space program. In the Soviet Union, similar recruitment unfolded. Knowledge mattered more than justice. Morality was expendable if it advanced a cause. The past was repackaged, forgotten, erased. As the 1950s and 60s unfolded, the world became a chessboard of tension. The Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, proxies bled while superpowers played. But behind every headline, the machinery of fear kept grinding. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in case of nuclear attack. Scientists calculated fallout zones, and entire cities were built underground, waiting for a war that might end everything in an instant. The bomb, that terrible inheritance of World War II, was no longer just a weapon. It was theology. It dictated diplomacy, shaped economies, haunted dreams. Mutually assured destruction, Matic became the strategy that held the world together through the threat of annihilation. But while nations danced on the edge of extinction, something darker continued to thrive in the margins. Old fascists found refuge in South America. Argentina became a sanctuary for war criminals who had escaped justice, many aided by networks of priests, politicians, even intelligence agencies. Entire Nazi communities were built in the mountains, their ideologies intact, their crimes forgotten. The hunt for justice became a footnote. Some were caught, Eichmann, in Argentina. Others died free. The world moved on. And then, in the 1970s, another truth surfaced, one even more disturbing than the war crimes. It came not from battlefields, but from hospitals, laboratories, asylums. MKUltra, a CIA program that sounded like science fiction. Mind control, hallucinogens, psychological torture. The agency had secretly dosed American citizens with LSD, experimented on psychiatric patients without consent, and pursued techniques to manipulate the human mind for warfare. What began as Cold War paranoia became an ethical collapse of staggering proportion. Files were destroyed, victims silenced, and once again the line between democracy and dictatorship blurred. In the East, the Soviet regime became its own kind of nightmare. Stalin may have died in 1953, but his legacy endured. Gulags, forced labor, secret police. Dissidents disappeared, books were banned, truth became what the state said it was. Surveillance wasn't just policy, it was culture. Trust eroded, children reported parents. The walls had ears and the air itself felt weaponized. Yet amid all this, people still resisted, quietly, dangerously. A word whispered in the wrong place could mean death, and yet whispers persisted. By the 1980s, the world stood exhausted. Technology had raced forward. The weapons were faster, deadlier. Satellites hovered. Computers hummed in bunkers. And then, the impossible happened. The Soviet Union collapsed, not from war, but from within. Economies crumbled. People starved. The old system devoured itself. Berlin's wall fell, not from bombs, but from hands, brick by brick, and for a moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. The Cold War was over. Democracy had won. The world cheered. But that's not the whole story. The scars remained, and the ghosts never left. Because behind every war, every revolution, every shift in power, there are the forgotten. The ones buried in unmarked graves, the ones used and discarded, the collateral damage of empire and ego. And as the 21st century dawned, history did not reset, it recycled. In the Middle East, old borders drawn by colonial hands erupted in violence. Regimes backed by Western powers fell, unleashing chaos. Terrorism, surveillance, endless war, it all returned, rebranded, modernized. The language changed, the fear stayed the same. And now, as we look back across a century soaked in blood, betrayal, and blind ambition, we must confront the truth. The greatest danger in history is not the madman or the tyrant. It's the ordinary person who stops asking questions, the one who believes it could never happen again, the one who looks away. Because evil rarely begins with a scream. It starts with a whisper. A treaty signed in haste, a speech that demonizes, a law that quietly removes a right, a scientist who chooses progress over morality, a journalist who stops reporting, a citizen who chooses comfort over truth. And then, when the silence is too loud to ignore, it's already too late. The history you were taught was never the full story. It was the version that fit into neat timelines and multiple choice tests. But the real history, the hidden history, is still here. In documents locked away, in voices erased, in rituals, in ruins, in records too uncomfortable to teach. And it waits, not just to be uncovered, but to be understood. Because if we don't understand what truly causes war, what really feeds dictators, what silence costs, then we will repeat it. Not because we want to, but because we forgot how not to.